Lift as we rise for 2022. I am Roshni Gajjar. A special welcome to those joining us on Apple Podcast for the first time. We heard your request and now you can access this podcast every month directly. Please subscribe to the channel and send through your feedback so I can ensure that these conversations are worth your time. You can catch episodes 1 to 18 on YouTube on the StratConnect channel. So during 2020 and 2021, we had a strong focus on setting the context for purpose-driven strategies as we transformed into the new normal. Now that we've settled down a bit, this year we're going to shift gears into strategy execution and performance and how that pans out in the next normal and leadership in that regard. I'm kicking off this season to talk about formula for sustaining success with Mark Gallagher, a man who has been in Formula One for close to 40 years, having led marketing, commercial teams and strategies at Jordan Grand Prix, at Cosworth F1 and at Red Bull Racing. In the media space, Mark has worked as a commentator and analyst and journalist on BBC 5 Live, Sky Sports F1, BBC News, CNN, Channel 4 News, CNBC, and Al Jazeera. Outside of Formula One, but still in motorsport, Mark was the founder and co-owner of Status Grand Prix that competed in GP2, GP3, Le Mans 24 Hours, and they won the 2009 A1 GP World Cup of Motorsport. Mark is the author of The Business of Winning, which is a book that kept me gripped over the December break. Mark, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on Lift as we rise today, and thank you for finding the time to speak with us.
No, it's a great pleasure to be able to join you today, and I'm really looking forward to the session, Roshni, and thanks so much for having me.
No, absolutely. So Mark, 39 years in Formula One, working in the areas of strategy, commercial management, and media. Almost sounds like my perfect career. After all these years, do you still feel as energized as when you started?
Actually, I think I'm more energized than ever because the sport has become more complex, but it's also become even more satisfying to observe great teams in action. And it's one thing in the 1980s or 1990s to be involved in Formula One because back then the teams were quite small. A big team might have had 100 people, 120 people in it. Jordan Grand Prix, when we started, I think I'm right in saying I was the 34th member of the team whenever we started. I just remember that from my badge that I got given when I joined the team. So very small teams back then. Of course, today we have teams which, in the case of Mercedes-Benz, if you include the powertrain division, 1,700, 1,800 full-time staff. So the job facing Toto Wolff as chief executive of Mercedes in Formula One is very much more complex than was the case 25 or 30 years ago. And then, of course, within the sport itself, it has become an incredibly more complex and richer environment as the world of business and technology has changed. And so today, I watch the sport as an observer, not being directly involved in a team anymore, but really just fascinated by everything that I see going on. So the car racing, I have to say, on a Sunday, sometimes leaves me, feeling quite neutral about it all. But that's because I love the business Monday to Friday, 52 weeks of the year. So sometimes the racing's great. Sometimes the racing can be a little bit indifferent, but actually I just love the industry.
Yeah, Mark, and that's really why we're having this conversation today. Many people are fans, some are not fans. But those who watch on a weekend are generally there to watch the sport, the technicalities and the competition. But behind that, there's a huge business and a business model. And that's what we'd like to get stuck into today. So for those who are new to Formula One, who may not be familiar with the business model, just to set the scene, Formula One is a wholly owned subsidiary of Liberty Media. Liberty Media bought Formula One over in 2017 at an EV of $8 billion. It is listed on the NASDAQ. It's trading around $55 recently. If we look at the revenues, 2020 revenue of just over $1 billion, 2020 EBITDA of around $56 million. The The cost of operations is about $1 billion, and the payouts to teams takes about another $700 million. Of course, these numbers do represent the 2020 results, and those are skewed with anomalies such as reduced races, adjust commercial contracts. Plus, in that was a once-off payment in respect of the Concord payment fee. Mark, as I understand it, revenue in Formula One is generated from three primary sources, being the race promotion fees, the broadcasting fees, the advertising and sponsorships. And over and above that commercial complexity, it operates like any listed business would. In other words, in the times we live in, something like ESG sustainability strategies is critical in terms of zero carbon, diversity, and contribution to communities. So that, if I understand it correctly, is at the holding company level, Mark. If we put on the lens of a team owner, take us through what the operating context and business model looks like.
Well, it's each team is slightly different because the ownership of teams varies. You have teams which are wholly owned subsidiaries of a parent company, such as the Ferrari Formula One team, which is part of the Ferrari group. And again, Ferrari as a company has a portion of its ownership available on the New York Stock Exchange, so it's a listed company. You have Red Bull, which wholly owns the Red Bull Racing Formula One team. And then you have a team like Mercedes-Benz, which strangely enough is not wholly owned by Daimler-Benz. It's only 33% owned by Daimler. The other 66% is shared equally between Sir Jim Ratcliffe, who is the owner of the Ineos Chemicals Group in the UK, and by Toto Wolff, who is the chief executive of the team. And actually, I think I'm right in saying that Toto Wolff is the only team boss today who actually owns a slice of the team that he runs. So each team is quite different in terms of shareholding and structure. But if you look at the business model, again, it's not dissimilar to the group structure. You have a number of sources of revenue. Commercial sponsorship has been the lifeblood of Formula One since the late 1960s. And for close on 40 years, commercial sponsorship was really responsible for the lion's share of revenue. And in fact, for much of that 40 years, we had one particular group of customers who were particularly large supporters of Formula One, which were the tobacco companies. And anyone listening who has followed Formula One for any length of time will remember that back in the 1990s, the teams were sponsored by the big tobacco brands. My team was sponsored by Benson and Hedges. In fact, Benson and Hedges sourced a lot of their tobacco leaf in South Africa, and we had Rothman supporting Williams, and we had Marlboro, of course, as a very large sponsor. I worked with Marlboro early on in my career, but tobacco sponsorship was banned in 2005. And what we've really seen over the last 17 years is sponsorship becoming diminished in size as a proportion of revenue to Formula One teams. In simple terms, there was no other sector quite like tobacco in terms of the amount of money that they were prepared to spend on Formula One. So although we have lots of sponsors in Formula One today, around about 260 companies sponsoring and supporting Formula One teams, none of them are supporting it to the level that we saw back in the tobacco era. So commercial sponsorship remains a significant portion of revenue. And again, depending on which team you talk to, it can be as little as 20% of their revenue, and it can be as much as 60% of their revenue, 60 to 70% of their revenue. So where does the rest come from? Well, you touched on the fact that the commercial rights holder, which is part of Liberty Media, Formula One Group, they provide a large amount of prize money. And in a normal year, pre-COVID, post-COVID, we would expect that prize fund to approach $1 billion, and that is then split between the 10 teams based on your finishing position in the previous year's championship. So whichever team finished first gets the largest amount of money, whichever team finished last gets the smallest amount. One of the big changes in Formula One we've seen in the last 2 years is the Concord Agreement, which is a commercial agreement between the teams and Formula One, which has created a more equitable share of prize money. So the sliding scale of payments has rather leveled off. It's not completely level, but it's a lot fairer today than really it was under the Bernie Ecclestone regime prior to the Liberty takeover that you mentioned in 2017. So that prize money is now really significant, really significant. And whether you're a small team in Formula One, if you're a small team in Formula One, that 50, 60, 70 million dollars that you get in prize money is quite significant. I mean, for some of the smaller teams, that really enables them to race with quite limited amounts of sponsorship coming in. For the larger teams like Mercedes and Red Bull, you're talking about well over $100 million coming in. And again, because they've also got quite good commercial sponsorship, this is why the top teams are the richest teams. So they've got the most prize money. They've also tended to attract the most commercial sponsorship. And then you have a number of other revenue streams upon which you can rely. So, for example, licensing and merchandising has always been more or less a good source of revenue. And again, for some of the very famous brands like Ferrari, that is a very significant amount of money. Many tens of millions can be generated from that. If you're a small team with a relatively unknown brand, such as, let's say, the Haas Formula One team, that's going to be quite a small amount of money coming in. And when I was on the commercial management at Jordan Grand Prix, we often commented on the fact that licensing and merchandise sales were quite often proportionate to how well your team was doing. So essentially, if you were doing very well, winning some races, if you had a famous driver driving for you, you tended to sell a lot of merchandise. And if the team wasn't doing so well, if the drivers were struggling, over the course of a year, you would see that diminish. So it was actually quite a variable income stream. So that's kind of those would really, for me, be the kind of three principal sources of revenue. The teams do not get a share of the television revenue directly, but they do get a share of the television revenue indirectly, because that's what really funds the prize money that comes into the sport. One of the final things that I'll mention to you, Roshni, is that I've been a big fan of some of the diversification strategies which Formula One teams have deployed in order to generate more revenue and income and profitability. The McLaren Formula One team set up their applied technologies business probably 20 years ago. Williams set up the advanced engineering business. Red Bull have an advanced technologies business. Mercedes-Benz now have as well. And we've seen some wonderful examples of technology transfer from Formula One into wider industry, where these business divisions of Formula One teams have been able to win good customer bases across industry and sell into sectors such as aerospace, defense, automotive, energy, etc., healthcare even. And one of the interesting things at the moment is that certainly in the case of Williams and McLaren, that strategy has not played out well in the long run. And I think it shows that actually the strength of a Formula One team tends to be in a prototype environment. So we're really strong in terms of prototype engineering. But if you want to create something that has real scale and volume, I think that's where the teams perhaps struggle. So it remains a chapter in Formula One's business story, which I think is incomplete. It remains that the jury is still out as to whether any of the Formula One teams today can really develop a diversified technology business off the back of their Formula One team. But it remains, as I said, an area which I'm very interested in.
Mark, thank you very much for painting that context, because it shows how complex things are, but also despite the fact that there are technical regulations and a formula, each team is unique in its setup, its business model, and how it remains sustainable in the business. And the example you gave around Toto Wolff is a crucial one, in that, he is differentiated from other team principals in that, if we can say it, he's got very serious skin in the game. So the difference between winning and coming second has serious financial implications. And hence, the driver's title and the championship title is so crucial, as we saw at the end of last year.
Yeah, and what's interesting about the changed business environment in Formula One over particularly the last decade, is because we have moved away from the team owners running their teams. Now I'm thinking about people like Ron Dennis, who ran the McLaren Formula One team from 1982 until just a few years ago. I'm thinking about Sir Frank Williams, who owned his own Formula One team from 1977 until his family sold the business just over a year ago to a private family investment company in New York. And as we've shifted away from these, I call them owner drivers. They own the business and they drive the business. As we've shifted away from that, what we now have in Formula One are professional team bosses. So they are employed, they are employees. They typically will be on perhaps a 3 or a 5 year contract. And as you may know, Roshni, in the last 12 months, we've actually seen 2 of the team bosses removed from their position. And we're talking about 20% of the Formula One team. So Otmar Safnauer, who was the team principal of the Aston Martin Formula One team, left the team just a few weeks ago. This is part of what appears to be a management shake-up under the relatively new owner, Lawrence Stroll, who owns the Aston Martin car company, or who has led an investor group which owns the Aston Martin car company. And then a year ago, we saw Cyril Abiteboul leave the Alpine Renault Formula One team. He was the team principal there. And indeed, one of his successors, Marcin Budkowski, has now left the team. And so at the risk of tempting fate, I've always liked the fact that Formula One is different from a sport like football, because we don't have a high turnover of coaches and senior leadership. And actually what we're now seeing in Formula One is that the turnover seems to be going up. And that, to me, is a sure sign of instability and perhaps some short-termism in terms of strategy. So it's a really interesting thing to watch. I'm a great believer that successful teams tend to have very stable platforms, stable leadership, stable structures. It doesn't mean that you can't have new people come in or out, but stability is extremely important to deliver sustained success over a period of time. So when you see teams like Aston Martin and Alpine undergoing change, it raises a question mark over whether the team's in a position to truly compete to win, or whether they're actually in just a state of transition. And of course, if you're in a state of transition, it's much more difficult to achieve your ultimate goal.
Absolutely. And if we look at it from a strategy and leadership perspective, I guess a change in strategy often requires the right type of leadership to implement something new, drive the change, and deliver a different outcome. And perhaps where we are at such a watershed time in humanity, and certainly in business strategies, these changes were likely to come. And perhaps with what's happening with the FIA investigation, we see some similar changes happening elsewhere in the Formula One world value chain.
Yeah, I think you're right. If we zoom out from this, leadership is such a big topic, and whether you're talking about political leadership in the world or business leadership, we know that there's a huge amount of study goes on around this topic. And as you know, I speak to organizations all the time about high-performance leadership and how to build a high-performing team. And yet what we see constantly in the news are examples of poorly led countries and poorly led businesses, and there's lots of examples where leadership is not being conducted in the right way. What we can say, however, is that certainly in my arena, Formula One, we live in the white heat of constant media attention. So if you're successful, your successful is writ large across everything that you do. And if you're unsuccessful, well, there's no room to hide. So I can understand why, when a team like Aston Martin has had a difficult year, Alpine has had actually a number of difficult years, you can understand why the shareholders then come around and say, right, we've got to make a change. We've got to find a new leader who can lead us to pastures new and to sunlit uplands of the future and achieve success. But, I'm going to mix lots of metaphors now. Rome was not built in a day. And one thing that we know from leadership in Formula One is that you need to give people time, and that includes the leaders. You need to give people time to build a structure, develop a strategy, implement that. And yes, by all means, be measured. But if you're measuring in the way that, for example, public companies do, which is if you're going to measure everything every quarter, and if you have a bad quarter, you're going to start changing everything. Well, it's really ultimately a short-termism. That's really not going to work. And again, I think there's no accident when you look at Red Bull Racing, which won the Drivers' Championship last year. Red Bull have been under the leadership of Adrian Newey and Christian Horner for what is now 17 years. And I think I'm right in saying Christian, he might even be the most experienced team principal in Formula One now, which I can't quite believe because I've known Christian since he was quite young. But anyway, the fact remains that stability has been key within Red Bull's delivery. Even so, when Christian Horner joined Red Bull Racing in January, February of 2005, and then Adrian Newey joined him within the year, it took 4 years for them to realize their ambitions in terms of the strategy for the business. And 4 years sounds like a long time, but in Formula One, it goes extremely quickly. And so when you see teams chopping and changing in the short term, you know that means they don't really understand the sport, because the sport needs a much more cohesive strategy from a strong leadership team, and to be given the time and the space to deliver that. And then again, with Toto Wolff coming into Mercedes-Benz, the Mercedes-Benz Formula One team had actually predated him, because under Ross Brawn, the team had been running through 2010, 11, 12, 13 by the time Toto came on board. And Toto admits, he joined Mercedes-Benz at a time when the team was already beginning to make good progress, but they then made that breakthrough and they've sustained performance, now winning the Constructors' Championship for 8 years. But again, stability and having a strategy, having a trajectory that takes you to the number one position is so important in our sport, and it is entirely measurable. So this is one of the reasons why I remain fascinated by it, because there are teams in Formula One that have never won a Grand Prix. There are teams in Formula One that never will win a Grand Prix as long as they continue to be structured and led the way they are. So the question for me is, why bother? Because if you're involved in Formula One and you have no chance of ever winning, and actually you have no strategy to ever become a winner, I'm not really sure what the point is, because I think it's an industry which thrives on a competitive mindset. And if you don't have that ultimate competitive goal of winning, it's difficult to see what the point is.
Mark, so we're talking about the long-term nature of investment in Formula One, continuity of leadership. And Formula One started in 1950, and Bernie Ecclestone led it for 40 years. I mean, at the moment, we've got 23 races across 22 countries over 5 continents. Most of the teams are centered in the UK. We've got 1.5 billion viewers across 170 countries. That means 87.4 million fans watch a race every weekend. Now, talking about leadership and how the business model and the reach of Formula One has diversified, that possibly requires a different type of leadership. And it's a costly business model, right? So even for those hosting the Grand Prix, it could cost anything from $15 million, like for the Monaco Grand Prix, right up to $55 million just to host it. So, in your career, you've worked with someone like Bernie Ecclestone. And in your book, you say the changes wrought by Bernie Ecclestone during the sport in the 1970s dragged Formula One into the modern era of commercialized sport. He recognized the value and he knew how to develop a highly profitable business model around it. Mark, what has made Formula One so attractive and so successful for more than 70 years?
Well, I think the fact that the sport of Formula One World Championship racing began in 1950 is itself quite telling, because the 20th century was a century of massive change in society around the world, and there's no doubt that the motor car played a really key role in that. And as motorized transport developed, I mean, frankly speaking, as soon as humankind developed the car, we started racing them. And by 1950, in the wake of the Second World War, the technology had moved on apace, because, again, unfortunately, it often takes a war for technological development to really accelerate. And so there was really a post-war surge in research and development around new cars, because effectively there'd been no development on cars during the 6 years of the Second World War. So when the UK, Britain, the French and Germans and the Japanese, in fact, a lot of the key belligerents in the Second World War, when they recovered, they began investing heavily in the car industry. And 1950 marked the start of that World Championship. And it's no accident that a number of major, very well-known manufacturers, such as Mercedes-Benz, such as Alfa Romeo, such as Ferrari, companies that are still involved in Formula One today, were using it back in the 1950s as a research and development and a marketing tool for their brands. I think the first 20 years of Formula One could be characterized as being semi-professional at best, quite amateur at worst. We had a dreadful safety record. Events were not particularly commercially successful. Drivers from that era often complained that you didn't make a lot of money out of it. I had the good fortune of meeting and interviewing Stirling Moss, who is one of Britain's most famous Formula One drivers of that era. And, he told me, frankly speaking, about how little money he earned as a Formula One driver back in the 50s and 60s. But when Eccleston came along, he was a businessman and he was very successful. So he was an entrepreneur who looked to create value. And when he became a team owner in Formula One, he could really see that the society just loved the car racing because it was glamorous, these fast cars, these beautiful brands. Of course, the fact that the teams were traveling, at that case, predominantly around Europe, but also to far-flung destinations around the world from time to time, it appeared quite glamorous. So it was a mixture of technology, of sporting excellence, of glamour, of travel. It was quite a heady combination. I think very much a kind of sort of slightly hedonistic sport, which I think for the 1960s was probably quite appropriate. So Bernie really set about packaging that for what was becoming the televisual age in the 1970s. And he did a number of very practical things to package Formula One for television, having the races on a Sunday. In a lot of countries around the world, Sunday was still a day of religious observance. And so there was no sport, certainly no professional sport on television on a Sunday in many countries. So simply by having Formula One events on a Sunday meant that you were guaranteed to have that television coverage. And then packaging the sport to be sold to television companies and to be sold to circuit owners and promoters. And so Bernie really created the demand was there, but he created the business model around the demand so that circuits could sell tickets to fans, so that the media could sell the TV coverage audience to commercial advertisers. And so the journey began. And really, one has to say that although Bernie Eccleston ultimately ran out of steam in terms of ideas to develop the sport, because he really stayed a little bit too long as leader of Formula One, there's no doubt that for the first 30, 35 years, he grew the sport exponentially. It was extraordinary to work in Formula One through the 80s and 90s and see just how big it had become. But the world has moved on from the model that existed back then, because as you and I know, the whole idea of selling sport purely on the basis of television, and I mean that in the purest sense, television coverage, is these days much more complex because people are streaming on mobile devices. They want on-demand service. They want to watch content when they want to watch it, where they want to watch it, how they want to watch it. The commercial landscape in terms of advertising on media has changed. The sponsorship marketplace has changed because, again, Formula One back in the 1970s didn't have too much competition in terms of global sports events. But of course, today, every sport in the world seems to have gone global. And so whether you're a tennis fan, a golf fan, a football fan, a hockey fan, a cricket fan, we all know there are multiple championships all selling sponsorships. So it's a very crowded marketplace. So it's the successful platform that Bernie built to some extent stagnated, I would say, from the early 2000s, certainly the mid 2000s, for over a decade. I had a real feeling within the sport that things were not moving on, and there was certainly a big resistance towards things like esports, computer gaming, social media. Social media was quite a blind spot for Bernie. Liberty Media taking over the sport was a perfect outcome. I think a lot of us were quite concerned that Formula One would be sold by CVC Capital, which was the private equity company that Bernie Ecclestone was appointed by CVC to continue in his role as chief executive. A lot of us were quite concerned that one private equity company would sell Formula One to another private equity company. And I'm not a big fan of what private equity companies do to businesses, because very often they're taking, again, quite a short-term view in terms of how do we just generate as much profitability as possible for our fund and then move on. So Liberty taking it over was great. They're a media company, so they understand media. They're an American media company, which means that you're in the hands of, one of the strongest commercial marketplaces. So they understand about commercialism, about sports commercialism, about sports rights, and they certainly understood the importance of growing Formula One on social media. So although the sport has been going since 1950, I'd have to say the period that we're in now, which started in 2017, so really we're only 5 years into this era, is the next chapter in Formula One, and it's proving to be exceptionally exciting, with lots of interesting developments, including the Netflix series, which has been a huge catalyst for attracting new fans and also returning fans who had slightly fallen out of this love with the sport during that period of stagnation that I talked about. So we're seeing a real crescendo in terms of enthusiasm for the sport around the world at the moment. And I think a lot of that very much stems from Liberty's good governance and ownership of the sport.
Mark, thank you for that insightful review of that perspective. And what I'm thinking is, I've heard quite a lot around the commercial success of Formula One and under Bernie Ecclestone's helm. I've heard about, the reference to shareholders and where we're at now. With the globalization of the sport, like with all other businesses, shareholders need to be looked at with a broader stakeholder group. And you've explained quite nicely earlier how changes, for example, in tobacco legislation from an advertising perspective needed F1 to look at things very differently and find other sponsors. Describe some of the leadership styles that you've seen in Formula One, and how have these leaders navigated through these big changes, in good ways or in not so good ways?
Yes, it's a rich tapestry, and there's the good and the bad. I think if I was to give you a broad sweep, having been involved in the sport since 1983, so next will be my 40th year, I would say that the leadership in Formula One to begin with was all about command and control. The teams were led by self-made entrepreneurs who very much ran their teams on quite an autocratic, dictatorial basis, and that actually was reflected in the way the sport was run by Bernie Ecclestone. And there was a certain appeal about that, because this may be a politically incorrect thing to say, but at least dictators make a decision. It might be the wrong decision, and they mightn't listen to too many people, but at least you're getting decisions. And Bernie certainly made more right decisions than wrong decisions. But the world has changed, and people have changed, and employees have changed, and society has changed. And over time, you really began to feel that the sport was out of step with the world in which it inhabited. And you can take a topic like, gender diversity or inclusion, or you can take a topic like environmental sustainability, or you can You can take a topic like, the mental health of employees. All of these topics weren't even talked about in those, probably the first 25 years of my career in Formula One. So it was basically a bunch of white European guys going car racing. The last 15 years have seen a massive change, and it's been for the good. And we've moved from that kind of autocratic, quite narrow style of leadership, exciting in its own way at that time in that place, to a much more enlightened style of leadership. And I think if you look at Stefano Domenicali, the chief executive of Formula One today, he has exactly the same passion for the sport that Bernie Ecclestone had. But Stefano is a very different personality. He's a professional manager. He went to Bologna University. He joined Ferrari, worked in a number of functions in the Ferrari team, rose through the ranks, really earned his stripes, went through that company, became team principal and chief executive, then went to Lamborghini, where he successfully ran the Lamborghini car company as chief executive for, I think, 4 years, and then was headhunted back to run Formula One. And Stefano's about my age, but Stefano is, a well-traveled man of the world who absolutely understands how the world has changed, and that's reflected in the way that Formula One conducts business today. And so suddenly you have the We Races One initiative, which was announced in 2020. I know that predated Stefano's arrival, but my point is that Formula One's leadership today are much more enlightened about diversity, inclusion, anti-racism, making sure that the talent pipeline into Formula One includes as many women as men, and people from any culture and any background are welcome to come and work in the sport. And that's been done in a much more on the front foot and much more intentionally, and being supported by the majority of teams in very active ways. So that's a really good change. And then if you look at the individuals running the sport, running the teams today, if you take, and again, I'll make no apologies for the fact I'm going to talk about the two most successful teams. If you take Red Bull Racing under Christian Horner, or you take Mercedes-Benz under Toto Wolff, they are both highly driven individuals, but they absolutely realize that their team is not about them. It's about the people they employ and cultivate and empower. And so Toto Wolff will happily tell you that he sees his role as creating an environment within which a group of people thrive and excel at what they do. And so he spends a lot of time, he's an avid reader. He was a very successful entrepreneur before he came into Formula One. And he's quite a young guy. He's in his, I think he's just still in his late 40s. A very different mindset. Mercedes-Benz, for example, have a recognition program where individual men and women represent the team on the podium when they win a Grand Prix. And I've interviewed, for example, Holly Chapman, who's a powertrain engineer. She was 28 years old when she was asked to join Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas on the podium for winning the Austrian Grand Prix back in 2020. And she told me, it's a moment in her life she will never forget. So here you have female members of staff at Mercedes-Benz representing the whole organization, and that's being done very intentionally because it sends out a powerful message about the fact that Mercedes leadership understands the power of team. We win as a team, we lose as a team, and every person, every man and every woman in the team plays a critical role in our success. And I think to a more or less similar degree, Red Bull Racing is exactly the same, and the other very successful teams in Formula One. So there's a more enlightened style of leadership. I'm a big fan of what I call servant leadership, what's known as servant leadership, where you see your role as being that of providing your team with what they need to deliver. I'm not sure that any of the team principals in Formula One would ever want to be described as a servant leader. But I think certainly some of them have the qualities of servant leadership, even though they remain highly competitive individuals. And of course, there are plenty of egos there as well. But nevertheless, I think there's a much more enlightened style. So I think whether you look at Formula One, Formula One group under Stefano, or whether you look in Formula One under Formula One teams like under Toto Wolff or Christian Horner, you certainly have a very different type of leader today in Formula One than we had 20 or 30 years ago. The one thing that remains I think, slightly problematic is if you looked around the boardroom table, there are still not that many women in senior roles in the Formula One teams. There are a lot of women in senior roles in the Formula One group. And, that's something that I think Formula One group could maybe put a few more of those individuals in front of a camera from time to time. Sasha Woodward-Hill, who's there and has worked with Bernie Ecclestone for many years, and she's remained under the Liberty ownership of Formula One. I mean, Sasha Woodward-Hill has probably been involved in more of the major contracts in Formula One than any other individual working in the sport today, and yet she's a relatively unknown person. She's not in the spotlight. So you have, but if you go into the teams, as I say, you look around the boardroom tables, there are not too many women. There are also not that many people of colour working in senior roles in Formula One teams. So there's a lot of work still to be done in that piece, but I think we're getting there, and that's very encouraging, because I certainly hope in my lifetime that the sport moves to a point where the leadership teams and the teams that operate in Formula One actually reflect the global audience that we serve in terms of the fan base. And that's how it should be, because we want the best people in the world to work in Formula One, not just the best people in the UK, Europe, or North America.
Yeah, Mark, thank you for positioning the diversity and inclusion component, because I really want to dig into that a bit deeper just a bit later. What we have also at the helm, a change in the FIA after quite a long time, Jean Todt handing over the reins to Mohammed Ben Sulayem, who is the first non-European in 117 years to take over the reins of the FIA. And he's come in, Mark, at a time where there are huge changes in regulation, in stakeholder requirements, but also following what happened in Abu Dhabi, or let's call it the Massey-gate affair. There's a massive trust deficit amongst fans, among stakeholders, and I'm sure it has had an impact on the brand equity of Formula One. The share price didn't dip too much. But what I want to ask you is, Mark, at the heart of this is a high competition sport, yet fair play is required. I mean, Zach Brown spoke quite forthrightly last week, I think it was. He said the current governance structure of the sport enables a situation where some teams, to protect their own competitive advantage, are effectively holding the sport hostage from what's best for the fans and therefore for the sport at large. He said it's vital that governance of the sport is strengthened to prevent certain teams from dominating. This year, we also have the cost cap rules. Hopefully that equalizes the playing fields. But Mark, how do the smaller teams compete against, let's say, the top three to survive and still remain competitive?
Well, I think Zach Brown is a good example of someone who's shown what's possible, because although McLaren could not be characterised as a small team, they've certainly been through a very difficult time. In recent years, they slumped really in terms of their performance, and that was all to do with leadership and structure. And it to my mind, is a case study of the fact that you can have a budget and you can have a nice factory and you can have clever people working for you, but if they're poorly led and it's poorly structured, you're not going to achieve success. So, and this very much reflects a point that I made earlier on in the podcast, Roshni, which is that there are teams in Formula One that are poorly structured, poorly led, and are not going to claw their way up into the winner's position. So the thing to remember, I think, for everyone listening, is that the reason that Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull, those teams, and McLaren now, resurgent McLaren, the reason those teams keep coming back to the surface is because they're very well led, very well structured organizations, and when you have a well-led company, you get good results. For the smaller teams in Formula One, there are some question marks. And for example, I'll just take two and talk about them briefly. The Williams Formula One team, when I came into Formula One, they were one of the giants of the sport, and through the 1980s and 1990s, they remained so. Unfortunately, the last time they won the Drivers' World Championship was 1997, so it's 25 years ago this year, with a Canadian driver called Jacques Villeneuve. So that's a generation ago. And I provided Williams with engines. I supplied Williams with engines when I was running the Cosworth company in 2010, 11, and was quite shocked by what I found, which was that it was a team that had quite a lot of arrogance based on its past glories. Wasn't a particularly friendly organization to deal with, and I felt it reflected the fact that the leadership structure that had developed was not fit for purpose in terms of where Formula One was moving to, and that's really then turned out to be the case over the last 10 years. The team had a brief moment of success in 2014-15 when, thanks to partly to the Mercedes-Benz engines, they actually finished third in the World Championship. But they really struggled, and it led to the team being sold. And there's no doubt in my mind that Williams was a team that didn't perform because the leadership structure and the leadership individuals were wrong. Now, I don't include in that Claire Williams, who is the daughter of Frank and was put into position of deputy team principal. I feel very much that Claire and Sir Frank were very, very poorly advised and supported by the management team around them. And of course, the trouble with having a management team around you who frankly tell you what you want to hear is that's not the route to success. You need a much more robust conversation, and you need a management team who are experts in their field. I think that's really important. You have to have people who really understand what's involved to be successful in this business. And the reason I mention Williams is that when the family then sold the business to this private family investment fund in New York just over a year ago, we've seen a remarkable turnaround in a year. And I spent like an hour with Jost Capito, the chief executive of Williams, just before Christmas. And Jost has only been in there, I think, for 7 or 8 months. And the team has moved from last in the championship to 8th. Now, moving from 10th to 8th may not seem like a big step, but as I mentioned earlier on, the prize fund depends on where you finished in the championship. So they've moved 2 steps up the ladder. And that's essentially with the same car, same driver, same factory. So what's changed? Well, what's changed is Jost told me all about the fact that they needed to get rid of the blame culture that existed in the company, that they needed to have a better structure where the team had representation on the management board. I mean, I know this might seem a bizarre thing to hear, but the Williams Formula One team did not have a representative on the senior management team, even though Formula One is their primary business. So there was something very strange there with the structure. And he also talked about the fact that they didn't have alignment. So there were different parts of the team kind of with their own agenda. So it wasn't a cohesive team. You didn't have that sense of alignment and common purpose. You mentioned purpose at the beginning of the podcast, and every organization needs to have a defined purpose and values and behaviors that the leadership sets out. And so I think just by getting the basics in place, Williams have really moved forward. And I have huge hope, actually, that under Jost Capito and the other senior leaders that he's now brought into the team, that team is going to advance over the coming years. And I think that will be a real success story. If you want to take an example of another team which has underperformed, in my opinion, over the years, we have a team in Switzerland, which is the Sauber Formula One team. They're currently effectively licensed to Alfa Romeo. There's a licensing deal there in place. So Alfa Romeo is the name of the team. But it has puzzled me no end as to why that team has never managed to carve its own path to the top of Formula One. They have a very impressive factory. They're in the center of Europe. Switzerland's a very attractive place to live in. It's quite an expensive place, but I mean, personally, I would love to have worked for them. I'd be going skiing every weekend during the winter. But there's been a block. And although they've made some good steps in recent years in terms of stability and structure, I have a concern that they're just going to continue to frankly make up the numbers. And as I said earlier on, I don't really see the point of that. You have to be in Formula One to win. And when you sit down and do a brutal analysis of where a team is at, you have to be prepared to say, what is it that is stopping this team from producing an innovative product that means that we have a competitive advantage over the opposition and leads us to the top of the table. Even if it takes us 3 to 5 years, this is what we need to do to put that in place. And that's what you want to see happen. You want to see leaders create a winning strategy and then implement that over a period of time. So what we see in Formula One is these very successful teams, well led, well structured, well organized, of course, well resourced, and they seem to be always floating to the surface, winning the races, challenging for the world championship. And then you have these other teams who make up the numbers, and it's therefore in many ways a parallel to the world of business, where you have some businesses which are just phenomenally successful, and you have other businesses which just bounce along, providing people with a livelihood, but don't actually make the breakthrough to the big time. And it really does ultimately come down to leadership and vision.
Mark, I want to pick up on the example that you've shared of Williams and Sauber, owned by Frank Williams and Peter Sauber. And I'm wondering, they started off as owner-managed teams, and until very recently, Williams was still an owner-managed team. And do you think that kind of mentality of a startup founder who self-funded the business, that appetite to do something bold, different, and courageous, because it's so cash intensive sometimes, you hold back on the changes you know are necessary because of the mindset of that small business? Is that perhaps what happened at a team like Williams prior to the sellout?
Yeah, I think what you've encapsulated that there is probably not untrue or unkind. I think that perhaps another way of putting it is that the industry outgrew those teams and those structures that they had in place. So they were, every team and its structure is usually of a time, and there was a time when that owner-driver-run Formula One team was the right way to do Formula One. It was when teams were much smaller and it was a much less complex environment. I don't think Williams moved on, and they perhaps missed opportunities. I think there were, certainly my take on my experience of working with them was the leadership at that time were quite underwhelming in the ambition and the understanding of their place in the world. I mean, you cannot live on past glories. And I think, Formula One today in 2022 is such a phenomenally global sport. There are not many large companies in the world that you couldn't walk into from a Formula One team and get an audience with senior management. Everyone knows Formula One, and most people quite like it. That may not be their favorite sport, but they can appreciate that it's a really interesting area to be involved in. So somehow Williams got themselves to a position where, despite their longevity and despite their earlier successes, they became a relatively unsponsored Formula One team that had no automotive group partner. They were having to effectively buy their engines from Mercedes-Benz. Something had not developed there in terms of a strategic vision for the business and what they needed to be doing. And I think I'm right in saying between 2009 and 2013, Williams had 4 different engine suppliers in a 5 or 6 year period. It was just change and transition and lack of stability and all of those good things. And I think similarly with Peter Sauber, Peter's a formidable guy, and he did an extraordinary job in building the Sauber Formula One team and making it into a consistently competitive midfield team. But again, there was a moment in time where Sauber could have been sold to Red Bull. And if things had played a little bit differently, I think if Peter had played his hand a little bit differently, Red Bull Racing would not be a team based in Milton Keynes. It would be a team based in Hindwell in Austria. And I've seen that happen a number of times where teams that are owned by an entrepreneur end up not realizing their potential because the entrepreneur actually blocks that. And, I won't go into all the stories about what happened, but suffice it to say that Peter Sauber and Red Bull ultimately had a parting of ways, and that parting of ways led to Red Bull buying another Formula One team, which was Jaguar, and setting up Jaguar Racing. Similarly, when I was at Jordan Grand Prix, we got to a point after 10 years where the team just wasn't going anywhere. We had done the giant killing act. We had won a number of races. We had finished as high as third in the championship. But to go to the next level, we really needed either to have an automotive company partner us or an automotive company buy the business. And we did have that offer. And Honda offered to buy the team from Eddie Jordan, and Eddie turned down their offer. And the result was that 5 years later, Jordan Grand Prix didn't exist because as a private-owned Formula One team, it just could not make the next step. So every team has a moment where you need to seize an opportunity and realize that the company has to grow. And sometimes for the company to grow, the owner-entrepreneur has to step to one side or accept a diluted position. And of course, that's often a difficult call for entrepreneurs, knowing the moment when it's right for you to sell. Not necessarily to sell out and cash out, but for you to accept that this is becoming a bigger beast than it was when you started it as a business. And I think that resistance to growth opportunities is what ultimately leads to the lack of success that you see in some of these teams which stagnate.
Yeah, Mark, high quality connections sound like are core to the sustainability of any team in Formula One, because it is a long-term investment that sponsors and stakeholders make. However, in order to scale up, you've got to move from that technical operational focus into more strategic thinking to really unlock the opportunities that the sport presents if you're going to put and invest so much money into it. So let's look at a sport that is high performance, high accountability, high risk. And David Coulthard, I think, put it quite nicely. He's saying, if you look at performance management and transparent reporting in a sport like Formula One, you're seeing those results every Sunday or every second Sunday, where everyone's performance in the team shows up. And you put it quite nicely in your book. You're saying at the end of the day, it's people working in teams who achieve success. The way they led, given clear targets, strong support, and the opportunity to be the very best versions of themselves, without fear of failure, helps to achieve success. And when I read that, I was like, wow, Mark, it's almost like we were sitting in the same room, because I've developed and piloted a program called the Resilient Success Program. I've worked with some entrepreneurs and rising stars in motorsport on this quite successfully. And absolutely, everyone has the potential to be a high-performance achiever, but it takes leadership to do that. So what sets teams like Mercedes-Benz, Red Bull Racing, Ferrari apart from the rest when it comes to human capital management, talent development, and retaining the best skills in the business?
Yeah, it's such an important area because whenever you look at any business, it's only as good as its people and how they collaborate and work together. And it's all about the sum of the parts, isn't it? The organization is greater than the sum of its parts. And that particularly is the case in terms of human capital. First of all, within Formula One teams, there's a constant desire to recruit the best people that you can. So we're constantly looking to fill that pipeline with talent. And as you pointed out earlier, most of the Formula One teams are based in the UK. So we tend to develop a lot of very strong relationships with universities and colleges to make sure that undergraduates, in terms of engineering technical roles, are attracted into Formula One and come and join our teams. Because again, one of the things that we know in Formula One is if you want to be at the leading edge of innovation, you've actually got to recruit young people because they are coming in with the latest know-how, technology, and an open mind to using it. There's a huge benefit, of course, to having very experienced people in your team, people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s who have been around for many years. But each age group has their strengths and weaknesses, and you want to have so from an age perspective, you want to have quite a diverse group of people, and then you also want, from a skills perspective, to have young, talented people as well as older, experienced people. And one of the things that, for example, Mercedes-Benz are very keen to point out is that when graduates join their team, they actually load them up with quite a lot of work and responsibility. And they do that not to test them, but to, frankly, give them the scope to be as creative and to contribute as much as possible. And there is a real philosophy, I feel, within successful Formula One teams that responsibility is not about your age or how many years of experience. Responsibility is given to people based on their capability, and your capability as a 23-year-old might be sufficient for you to be given quite a lot of responsibility. So one of the things that people often comment when they come to a Formula One race is how young people are in the teams, and loading people up with responsibility is a good thing because actually these young, enthusiastic employees coming into a team, they might have done an engineering degree and perhaps a master's degree. So they might have spent 5 or 6 years in academia, come into the Formula One team. Within a couple of years, by the age of 26, 27, they can be in really quite senior roles and loading them up with experience. And then, of course, you mentioned the D word, career development. So then you've got to, what can you do to give these folks an opportunity to develop their career? Well, again, as Formula One has become more complex, as we've gone from teams of 1 to 200 people up to teams of 1,000, 1,500 people, that means there are many more roles, functions, and therefore opportunities for career development. And again, one of the reasons I loved the diversification strategy that McLaren and Williams first pursued was the fact that engineers could be offered the opportunity to step outside of the Formula One stream of work into working in some of the diversified technology areas which were opening up. And that was an extremely good way of keeping people. But there is no doubt that as a sport, once someone has worked in your factory or worked in your racing team for a period of time, you need to offer that career development, otherwise you will lose them. And so the teams do put a lot of time and effort into offering people career development, role development. And if a team such as Mercedes-Benz, for example, moves into another category of racing, such as Formula E, they can offer members of the team the opportunity to move into that other category and to be deployed in that. Red Bull Racing, of course, have their Red Bull Technologies business, and they have had quite a large number of people work on the development of the Aston Martin Valkyrie sports car program over recent years, and they have, again, further ambitions for that business. But ultimately, if you take the people who travel to the Formula One events around the world, there is definitely a sell-by date, a kind of use-by date, where once you've been working in that traveling environment for 10, 15 years, most people have in their private life moved into another cycle where perhaps they're settling down, starting a family, and you start to see the change where people don't particularly want to travel as much, and this is where they perhaps move back into a factory-based role, or maybe they decide that actually they need to move out of Formula One into a slightly calmer, more mainstream engineering or technology company, which offers them a more standardized kind of Monday to Friday job rather than 23 weekends of the year trying to beat the competition around the world. So the sport does lose people, and that's why the pipeline of young talent remains so important. But ultimately, what we have is an industrial sector in the UK where you have 8 Formula One teams, between them employing around about 11,000 full-time staff. That's a lot of jobs. we have about 23,000 jobs in the supply chain. They're not all full-time. Some of them are indirect part-time. But you're talking about, therefore, an industrial sector in the UK, which is quite large, over 30,000 people involved in the sport in some way, shape or form. So although there is a turnover, actually in many ways that's quite healthy, because as James Allison, I think it was at Mercedes-Benz, Chief Technology Officer there at Mercedes-Benz, pointed out to me, there is actually a benefit to having a refresh of talent over a number of years. So although they spend a lot of time and effort trying to ensure stability, keep people in the team, give them career development, there is ultimately a recognition that we're all in this box marked Formula One, and sooner or later people may want to move on. But bringing in that fresh talent, those young, passionate, highly skilled graduates from universities, a really good way of refreshing the business, bringing their ideas in and giving them great scope and opportunity. And one final point I will say to you is that I'm very often struck by how often when I'm online surfing looking for some piece of technology, you'll find a company will say, this product it's derived from Formula One technology. And it might be a watch company, or it might be, I was recently looking at buying an e-scooter, and it was an e-scooter company I was looking at, and they were talking about how their Formula One technology built into it. And when I looked at the company a little bit more, I realized it was two former Formula One engineers who'd set the company up. So what we actually find is that Formula One is an incubator for a lot of great technology and people who then go on to pursue their careers including in setting up new businesses. So it's a very dynamic environment to work in, and the Formula One teams, I think, really relish the fact that they are so attractive to young, bright engineers who want to come and work in the field.
Mark, thank you. There's so much that we could discuss under the banner of human capital, Formula One, and business in general. I'd like to chat to you about succession planning, for example, in a legacy sport like Formula One, where people tend to stay there for a long time. I'd also like to speak to you about how the talent skills mix is working in terms of the migration to social media and a younger audience, etc. But I want to leave enough time for an area that I'm particularly interested to hear more about as it pertains to Formula One, and as it sets the scene for the automotive sector and other sports. Because I can no longer de-link strategy, human capital, and diversity and inclusion when I think of the S in ESG. So let's go to diversity and inclusion. If we look at females, you mentioned Claire Williams. Remember at Sauber, we had Monisha Keltenborn. Those ladies were in leadership roles and they didn't sustain their careers for whatever reason. We have one driver of color in the paddock at the moment, no female drivers, yet there are female engineers and strategists, particularly strategy at Alfa Romeo, Red Bull Racing, Mercedes, and one more, Aston Martin, run by a female strategist. And that's fantastic to see. Will they last? In other words, what prevents women from staying and succeeding in Formula One?
So I don't think anything prevents women from staying in Formula One. I think the sport has only relatively recently moved in a very active way to ensure that women feel wanted in the sport to the extent that they now are. And what I mean by that is there were very practical reasons why, first of all, Formula One teams began to cultivate relationships with universities to attract men and women, male and female engineers. And that is that we have a shortage of engineers, and there's a shortage of engineers in the world. There's a shortage of engineers in Europe. There's certainly a shortage of engineers within the automotive industry. And Formula One teams are competing, not against each other, they're competing against other industrial sectors. So whenever we recruit engineers into Formula One, those engineers could easily go and work for Airbus, they could work for Jaguar Land Rover, they could go and work for BMW in Munich, or they could go and work for Mini. So we're in the middle of the competition for engineering talent. And the fact that Formula One was a predominantly male-dominated sport until 20 years ago, was a real structural problem. Just let's not talk about it from a diversity point of view. From a business strategy perspective, it was a really rubbish strategy because 50% of the population were being ignored in terms of their potential to join our industry and fill the skills gap. So the last 20 years have really been marked by a big push towards programs such as Formula One in schools, Formula Student. Formula Student is aimed at undergraduates to get men and women who are at university to consider getting involved in motorsport as a career. And actually, I think I'm right in saying that every female race strategist in Formula One, these are very senior roles that these women hold, all of them have come through a Formula Student program while at university. So it has introduced them into the sport. And if you take Holly Chapman, who I mentioned earlier on, she was on the podium with Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas in Austria in 2020. I mean, Holly's story is so typical because she wasn't even remotely interested in Formula One as a teenager and didn't know anything about it, didn't follow it. And she told me that what got her involved was that she had decided to go to Loughborough University to study engineering, and she was good at those subjects, and so engineering was kind of her thing. But what led her into Formula One was that her stepfather was a fan of Formula One, and so she wanted to build a relationship with her mother's new partner, with her stepfather. So she started watching Formula One races with him on Sunday, and she said in no time at all, she became completely fascinated with the complexity of this sport and the engineering and the technology and this data-driven environment. And she told me, she remembers applying for this job when she came out of university. She applied for this job at Mercedes-Benz as one of a number of jobs, genuinely didn't even imagine she would get an interview, then was surprised to get an interview, then was even more surprised to be invited back for a second interview, and then couldn't believe it when she landed a job. And she told me that story off the back of the fact that 3 years later, she finds herself standing on the top step of the podium at the Austrian Grand Prix, spraying the champagne with Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas. And she said, 10 years ago, I didn't even know Formula One really existed, never mind as a potential for my career. So there is a real story of how the sport needs to communicate to women, to people of color, to all of the sectors of society that it previously was ignoring. And it wasn't ignoring. There wasn't a strategy. This all again grew out of the fact that you had this small group of men, white European guys running Formula One teams, which had previously been quite small organizations. So as the sport has outgrown their mentality. So of course now what we have today is you have 10 teams who are falling over themselves to get into universities and say to boys and girls, men and women, please come and work for us and consider Formula One as a career. There are internships, there are apprenticeships, and of course through the Formula One in the Schools program, which is aimed at 8 to 18-year-olds, we're trying to get boys and girls to choose the relevant subjects at a young age so that it leads to a pathway into Formula One. So the sport has really undergone a big shift. And what's, of course, so interesting is everyone knows that teams struggle if you have too many like-minded people from similar backgrounds. You get this groupthink develop where no one questions what's going on because essentially they're all clones of each other. So one of the benefits of having a much more diverse organization, men and women, people from different backgrounds and colors, you literally get a richer input to the team because everyone brings their creativity, their innovation, their ideas. You get higher quality of decision making, higher quality of outcomes, higher levels of performance. And if you take, for example, the fact that we know that when you put women into frontline roles in a competitive team, it changes the team dynamic. All of those, quite frankly, dreadful male behaviors around this kind of testosterone-driven environment, a lot of the bad behaviors which comes with that, those dissipate because as women move into the more frontline roles, you get a different dynamic. And some people have said to me, oh, it's a more caring environment. It's not about the women ending up in frontline roles and suddenly everyone cares for each other more. But there's no doubt that there is a dynamic that really changes. The professionalism of the team moves up a gear. You don't get the negative behaviors that were all too common in previous years. So as you get this richer environment, you move into a stronger position as an organization. So again, if for no other reason than the fact that it's good business, everyone knows that this is the right way to move things forward. And then when you move into the topic of people of color, and you mentioned the fact Lewis Hamilton is the only black driver, for example, in Formula One. So this was a glaring omission. And we're at the dawn of the age of that changing in Formula One. And we're at the dawn because Lewis is the first black driver, and not just the first black driver, but he is the greatest driver of the contemporary era of Formula One, no question about it. That's leading to change. That should lead to change. But let's also look at the fact that Africa is the only continent where we don't have a Formula One race. And that's not because Africans don't like Formula One. In fact, quite the opposite. Anywhere I've ever been in Africa, people are like, we love Formula One. So actually, Formula One is the beginning of its journey for the sport to represent the global audience. And we, of course, what we need is Formula One teams not just working with universities in England, but working with universities all over the world to bring in the right talent so that engineering graduates from South Africa, from Brazil, from any country you care to mention, know that there is a potential route for them to come and work in Formula One. And I know that day is going to come, and it's closer now than at any time. And it will be great when we start to see those new faces and people come into the sport. It's changed enormously already, and I think we're going to accelerate that further.
Mark, thank you. This is an area that's probably going to require a lot of strategic thinking, critical thinking, and work with the new leadership at the FIA level and at the Formula One level. I mean, the policies around female empowerment and climate change on the E and S side are quite strong. I haven't yet seen a policy around diversity in terms of inclusion of people of different color. And we know that the Hamilton Commission has published a report. Some steps are being taken. Once again, that's quite a European-centric model, a UK-based model. And I've been wondering, how does that get replicated across to other countries? If you take South Africa as an example, it's not new to racing. Grand Prix prior to Formula One happened here in 1934. Starting in 1967, we had races at Kyalami, stopped for a while. The last one happened in 1993. It's just the sheer cost of hosting an event for a country like South Africa, a continent like Africa. One's got to look at the viability model. And what I find interesting is that the Miami Grand Prix is the only example where Formula One has collaborated with the hosting track to try and make it more affordable so that they can tap into a broader American market. And perhaps models like that for the emerging market, particularly on the African continent, would be good to consider. But I'm quite sensitive to diversity and inclusion, having grown up in South Africa as a female of color. And I know how difficult and complex it is to move from a policy and a strategy into outcomes that really change the narrative. So it would be interesting to see how that moves under the new leadership. Mark, we've covered so much. There's one key point I think it would be remiss of me not to address, and that would be the move towards net zero in 2030, and also, of course, the move towards esports and greener ways of participating in Formula One. Give us a snapshot of that.
Well, I think the most important thing is that in November 2019, Formula One Group, the commercial rights holder, outlined this program this strategy whereby Formula One will have net zero emissions by 2030. And when I say Formula One, That's the car racing. It's all the travel and transport, all the air freight, people traveling to the events, and that that was a really big announcement. I'm not sure it really got enough pickup. I think the media reported it, but the problem is that there's a degree of greenwash going on around the world at the moment. Every company seems to have a sort of a green policy, but the question is, what real difference is this going to make? I talk about this quite a lot to organizations because Formula One is deadly serious about the fact that it wants a world championship to have net zero emissions by 2030. And again, we're doing that because it's good for business. It's good for business because our commercial sponsors want to be involved in a sport which is seen to be environmentally sustainable. Our employees want to work in an industry which is doing something positive for the climate. I'm delighted, for example, that the Williams Formula One team have said that net zero is not good enough. They actually want to be climate positive in terms of their contribution. So there's a really big mindset change. And what we're going to see is that in 4 years' time, 2026, Formula One will stop using fossil fuels. We'll start using a synthetic fuel, and probably be a synthetic fuel which is produced by taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So taking the bad stuff back out of the atmosphere and turning that back into a hydrocarbon, which can then be burnt in an internal combustion engine. The internal combustion engine gets a lot of bad press because of the burning of fossil fuels. There's not really a problem with the internal combustion engine. The problem is what you put into it. And if the thing that you put into it has to be drilled out of the ground and refined, and if it then just produces emissions which go into the atmosphere, well, that's the problem. It's the energy source. It's not the mechanical system. So there is a lot that's going to be a big shift. And what I'm very excited about, in fact, I'm currently writing a feature about this for a magazine I write for in the UK, are all of the other strategies that are or all the other tactics that will be employed as part of this strategy. So moving away from there'll be no single-use plastic at any Formula One events. They're going to ensure there's no food wastage by making sure that any excess food is then provided into the local community. They're going to look at reducing the number of people who fly to races. They'll look at the fuel used in the aircraft that they fly to races, because again, air travel per se is not the problem. It's what you put into the engine. And some of your listeners may know that two of the largest producers of jet engines for civilian aviation, General Electric and Rolls-Royce, have both committed to shifting over to being able to run their jet engines on biofuels and synthetic fuels within the next 3 to 5 years. So we're going to see a big shift in basically what the source of energy is. So there's going to be a lot of change in Formula One. I'm really excited about it because I think that due to Formula One's visibility, they're not going to be able to fudge this. They'll either deliver or they won't deliver. And if they deliver, it's going to be a great case study. And if they don't deliver, there'll be a lot of questions asked. And again, going back to your point about share price and shareholders, shareholders want to see responsible companies and responsible governance. So it's a very exciting time in terms of that topic. And then part of that shift in Formula One into the future is also ensuring that we embrace our younger fans and grow the business in terms of our online representation. And that's where esports has such a big role to play, because the great thing about esports is you can compete in esports without moving people all over the world. You just move data. And I love that connected environment. So I think esports in a kind of tangential way is actually all part of that move towards making the sport more accessible, democratic, egalitarian, and frankly, sustainable for the planet.
Yeah, Mark, having worked in the ESG sustainability strategy space since about 2009, that hits back to the point you made earlier. There you need long-term thinking and continuity of leadership, because those outcomes cannot be delivered overnight. And same with your stakeholders. They've got to stick with it and also support the process and the strategy so that the sport as a whole can deliver the outcomes, rather than that being a competitive advantage or something that looks good on your marketing brochures, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's For me, I think that the litmus test for ESG is what you actually do rather than what you say. And the again, as I mentioned earlier on, every major company that I come into contact with, I go on their website and they'll have an ESG section and they'll be talking about all these fine things. We need to see action, and whether it's making sure that our teams are representative of the society we serve and that we offer equality of opportunity, or whether it's the fact that we don't just talk about how we can change our business model to address this fundamental problem of climate change and man-made global warming. And by the way, I use the words advisedly because I'm always very conscious these days. You talk about men and women, man-made or humankind. But I mean, there's no doubt that global warming is absolutely a man-made activity because it's been principally men who've developed all of those technologies in the 1900s and the 2000s and then deployed them without any second thought for the impact on the climate. Unfortunately, now in these more enlightened times, we have men and women putting in place the solutions, which hopefully will be put in place. And it feels urgent, and I think one of the things that we can all reflect upon over the course of the last 2 years is that the global pandemic has really made us realize how small the world is and how fragile all of our ecosystems are, including our own health. And so every government and every company in the world ought to now be pressing the reset button in terms of their approach to creating a much more sustainable environment for their business and for the society that they serve.
Mark, thank you very much for claiming on behalf of your gender the issue with climate change and where it stemmed. And perhaps you can call the women in now into the boardrooms to help you sort that out and resolve it, because I think this is a collective problem.
Well,
Mark, big month coming up. Sorry, continue.
I was just going to interrupt briefly, Roshni, and say that I'm the first one to put my hand up and say that in the first 20 years of my career, I was one of the sort of white European guys running Formula One teams sponsored by tobacco companies, and we didn't think twice about the amount of fossil fuels we were burning or the promotion of smoking and indeed other alcohol and all the rest of it. And I now look back and with a degree of embarrassment because I look at my own kids who are now in their 20s, and I think we all have been on a journey of change, and my industry certainly has been. I know I have been, but that's part of life. And I think the importance is not where you've come from; it's where you're going, and the way in which you are prepared to accept it. We haven't gotten everything right in the past, so we just need to move forward in the right way and make sure that we listen to the younger generations coming through, because they will ultimately live with the decisions that are being made today.
Absolutely. So that integration of purpose, performance, people, profits, which is what I advocate in our strategy work, becomes crucial, because it's not just about chasing those numbers any longer. Or if you're chasing the numbers, make sure it's looking at the holistic picture. So Mark, big month ahead, crucial meeting tomorrow, and then on the 14th, the FIA investigation. And it's all running quite late before Bahrain this year. So wishing the teams and yourselves best of luck as you go through this challenging month that lies ahead of you. And I hope that we see Lewis Hamilton starting on the grid, because, his role in Formula One is beyond what he does in the car. And it's inspiring millions of people around the globe who otherwise would not have had something to aspire to and kindle that dream.
Yeah, I for one really believe Lewis will come back stronger, even more competitive. I think every time Lewis Hamilton has faced adversity in his life or career, he has risen to that. And it actually supercharges him. And I think that after this particularly difficult few months in the wake of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix controversy, I think Lewis will come back as more than a force to be reckoned with. It's going to be a fascinating season in Formula One, because not only will Lewis want to absolutely destroy the competition. But he now has a new teammate joining him at Mercedes-Benz in the form of George Russell, who many people know is he's an extremely exciting young driver. And but I don't think Lewis will be in any way, shape, or form put off by the fact that he's got a young guy joining him, because he's shown a clean pair of heels to his teammates over the years as a general rule, and I think he'll relish that prospect again. It's fascinating, and you're right, Lewis Hamilton has a role way beyond what he does in the cockpit of a racing car. He's an inspiring person. There's so much to the Lewis Hamilton story, which is very powerful for Formula One, and I hope that not only does he enjoy this next 2 years of his career at Mercedes, he's contracted for the next 2 years. Not only will he enjoy that and be very competitive, but I hope that when he one day decides, perhaps in 2 years' time or 3 years' time, to hang up his racing helmet, that actually he stays firmly involved in the sport of Formula One, because I think that's extremely important to ensure that his legacy is as rich as it possibly can be. So he's a great guy and a great ambassador for Formula One.
Well, if nothing else, there's a whole talent pool in Africa waiting to be unlocked. So,
Yeah,
Lewis,
exactly.
stick in there and come and help us out.
Yeah, can you imagine out there somewhere, maybe amongst your listeners, there's some young person who's going to be the next Adrian Newey, designing a Formula One car that wins championships, or driving a Formula One car and winning championships, and bring it on, because we need the best talent in the world to come into our wonderful sport. And thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Mark, thank you. Thank you for making the time and generously sharing your insights and information. It's been fascinating. I thought we'd run out of time, and we did, but I think we encapsulated the key points, and I hope we can continue this conversation either on the podcast or offline.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Yeah, a huge thank you to our tech team, Moby Learn. They're doing some amazing work to empower businesses, universities, and communities with digitizing learning content and meetings and conferences with cutting-edge digital technology. Check out their website, www.mobylearnafrica.com. Listeners, thank you for sticking it out and listening to Mark and myself in this fascinating conversation. I hope you've gleaned a lot from it and that it helps your high-performance strategy in your business. And if you'd like to start that journey, you can reach us via www.stratastute.co.za or reach out to me via LinkedIn, and we can start a conversation. Before I go, remember to lift as you rise so that together we can thrive. Thank you so much and take care. Bye-bye.